on a personal note, because you said you've suffered from depression, and there's a lot of people that see guidance on this topic because it's such a difficult one. How were you able to, when it has struck you, how were you able to overcome it?
Yeah, I mean, this is maybe too long an answer. So I've experienced it in different forms. So it was I would say my depression has almost always mostly taken the form of anxiety. I didn't realize how anxious I was, I think, until I was an adult. So I was always very functional. I think, all the positive sides of suffering in that way. I think I'm a little OCD, as you can tell.
I mean, this whole conversation
Yeah.
is hilarious because we're both suffer to some level of
Our
anxiety.
psychology is just laid out in front of
Yeah,
us here.
it's just a giant mess.
We're the
It's
same kind
great.
of human. Yeah.
It's great.
Just trying to organize.
Just hold on, like the Tom
Yeah,
Waits song.
exactly. But then I suffered from postpartum depression after both of my daughters, after both pregnancies. That was a very different experience from anything I've ever experienced, but clearly I had a predisposition towards, suffering from something like that. Anyway, it really wasn't until I fully recovered from the second experience of postpartum depression that I realized that I had been suffering on some level my whole life. And I think I always knew I thought of myself as a very sensitive person, an empathic person. I mean, I've been in therapy for 10 years. I knew I had a lot of anxiety. I would never have denied that I had a lot of anxiety. I just didn't realize it crossed over into a disorder really until I was an adult and ended up taking Prozac. I took an SSRI for postpartum, and it was fascinating to me. I ended up interviewing my psychiatrist because I was so fascinated in the whole thing. Once I was on the other side of it, just what I had been through, how different I felt during that period of time, and then how quickly the medication made me feel like myself again. I had come out the other side of the experience of postpartum, and was going to start tapering off the medication. And in this window where I no longer had postpartum depression, um, and hadn't yet gone off the SSRI, I realized that life was not only a lot easier than when I had postpartum, but it was easier than it had ever been. And it took taking all of that anxiety away to recognize how much I had been grappling with it my entire life. And it first started coming in the form of realizations like, oh, is this how other people like,
Yeah.
is this how other people feel? Is this how that like the things that I just always thought of myself, I'm really sensitive. I'm an introvert. I need a lot of time to myself. And all of these things that I felt like, I mean, it's always very high functioning. And in some ways, I was a professional dancer. And I think that was the type of therapy for me. There was the obsessing over the training and dancing 9 hours a day and all of that. I now look back on and see how much that was therapeutic for me,
Yeah.
and that I was kind of treating something. But yeah, it was just this experience of um, treating an anxiety disorder that caused me to realize that I had one. I didn't know I could feel the way I felt after taking Prozac. And I became very interested in, I mean, I was already working with neuroscientists. I was already interested in consciousness in the brain. And it just, this kind of rattled other intuitions for me in terms of how our childhoods shape who we become. Because I had been convinced my father was my father
He's
was
a
a
complicated person, as you said before.
that's what I was just going to say again. But I mean, so he was not diagnosed. I think I think he had borderline personality disorder and was emotionally abusive. And I thought that all of the ways I experienced the world and all of my anxiety and my sensitivities, um, I thought almost all of that, if not all of that, was because of these experiences I had growing up and trauma that I experienced as a child. And obviously, those things play a part. But what I realized after going through postpartum, and then the thing that was extremely informative to me was having my own children. Um, because they were basically living my dream childhood. They had none of the things that I thought were the cause of the psychological suffering that I experienced. There was none of that. And they have a lot of the same, they struggle with a lot of the same anxiety and panic attacks. And what I realized was how much we're kind of born into the world with these things that we struggle with, and with our strengths and with all of that. And of course, then if you have an abusive childhood, if you're someone who tends to be anxious and sensitive and empathic, and then you're born into an abusive situation, that's obvious terrible combination. But I never acknowledged or realized how strong just the genetics and the wiring played.
Where's the line between you kind of accepting the challenges you're born with and this is what life will be versus then figuring out that life can be somehow different?
I think they're part of the same process. And I think it's kind of necessary to accept what you're experiencing and what the situation is and how you feel and the types of thoughts and patterns you tend toward in order to make whatever changes can be made. So I do think it's kind of part of the same process.
I mean, could life have been any different? I mean, do you regret certain aspects of the decisions made, not by
I
you?
mean, it depends on what level we're talking. I think, at a fundamental level, I don't believe anything could be different.
Are you able to think about at that level about your own life?
Sure. And that's part of what I was, when I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the levels of usefulness of being aware of these different illusions, because I would say most of the time in our daily lives, the types of illusions that I'm interested in shaking up are not useful to remind ourselves of most of the time. I really think there are different levels of usefulness to thinking about and reminding ourselves of the places where we have false intuitions. And so I often use um, the analogy of living on a sphere. So it still feels to most of us most of the time. I mean, our intuitive sense, we're not thinking about whether the earth is flat or a sphere, but we behave as if it's flat. And that makes the most sense. And um, it would be exhausting to keep reminding ourselves as we walk down the street, like, it feels flat, but it's not flat. It's like there's just no reason to do it. It's not useful in that moment. If you're building a house, you can build it as if the world is flat. And but of course, so there are psychological reasons to bring it into view, and maybe even spiritual reasons to bring it into view, and then there's just like usefulness. So if you're building a rocket to the moon, you better understand
Yeah.
the geometry of the earth. Even if you're flying an airplane, if you're an airplane pilot, you have to be aware of the truth of our situation. And then I think there are other places where it's interesting to remind ourselves. It's where I start out my book, just as a way to inspire awe and to get yourself out of your everyday life and see the big picture, which can be just a relief, but also helps you feel more connected to the universe and to something larger than ourselves. And so I see these intuitions, reminding ourselves that these intuitions are illusions in the same way that most of the time they're not useful. They are useful if we want to think about a science of consciousness. They're useful for a whole range of neuroscientific studies. And I think they can be incredibly useful in the same way that lying on the ground and feeling the gravity pushing you against a sphere and realizing you're floating in the middle of outer space. It gives me the same feeling to realize. And so I have I mean, there's so many levels to it, but if I'm thinking about difficult things that I've experienced, different traumas in my life, when I take a step back and kind of get this bird's eye view of kind of the mystery of this unfolding of the universe and the fact that um, it happened the way it happened, and whether it could have happened another way, there's no going back. That's the way it unfolded, and being able to surrender to that, I think, is very psychologically healthy and prevents us from. I mean, I think regret is one of the most toxic loops we can get into.
So this is a path to acceptance.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Because free will, I mean, I think part of what the function of the experience of it is learning. I mean, I think we can still learn without being under the illusion that we have free will.
So for some people, depression can destroy them. So how can you think about avoiding
Yeah,
that?
yeah. So I didn't totally answer your question. First is therapy, ways that I have worked through anxiety and depression.
So you're an introvert and a deeply intellectual person. Therapy works for you?
To a point. It was very helpful. I mean, I think talk therapy is one tool and can be helpful for, I mean, it depends on the therapist, depends on the type of therapy, but I found it to be one piece, and probably not the biggest piece, actually. But I think I wish I had discovered medication sooner. That would have made a big difference in my life.
Even just intellectually to realize that, oh, like I'm not
Life was a lot harder than it needed to be.
Yeah.
And it wasn't about keeping everything just so.
Yeah.
There's another state my brain can be in where I don't have to work so hard to be okay. Meditation was probably meditation and psychedelic experiences were probably the most transformative. But a lot of these things don't. I'm lucky that I didn't. My anxiety and depression never really got in the way of my living my life, of enjoying my life. I mean, there were struggles. It made life harder for me. Um, but, something like treatment-resistant depression or severe PTSD, these are things that, at this point in time, based on my understanding, I think once you've tried, and the truth is that meditation is often not helpful for those things. It can actually exacerbate them. And the most promising thing that I have seen is this research into psychedelic therapy-assisted psychedelic